Well, I'd like to thank you all for coming out this afternoon to our winter lecture series here at Gettysburg National Military Park. My name is Siggins. I'm one of our seasonal rangers here, so I'm usually only here in the summer times. This is my first winter lecture, and I'm really excited to be here today. I always miss being here in the off season, and it's a real pleasure and privilege to be able to come and speak with you today. As you can see, my topic is about religion and the American Civil War today. And I'm convinced that understanding religion and its importance for the Civil War era is too often a neglected topic in our field of study. In this period that is so often defined by cataclysmic political and military events, it's really easy to overlook the religious events or to view them as being of relatively minor importance. And I think another reason we also often tend to overlook the importance of religion at the time of the Civil War is that our cultural situation today is very different from theirs. Religion today plays a much smaller role in American cultural life than it did in 1860. And it's easy as we study the past to forget that most people in the past did not look at the world through the lens of our contemporary eyes. Religion at the time of the Civil War was a central and foundational part of the American cultural experience. And in his excellent book, The Civil War as a Theological Crisis, which I would recommend to all of you, Mark Knoll notes of the time period that between 1/3 and 2/5 of the entire population were formal members of churches, but that more than double that at the time were active participants in some kind of religious community. And that's compared to today, where more than half of the formal members of churches are not active participants in their religious community. Also highlighting the importance of religion in the 1860s, more than 3 to 4 times the amount of people who voted in the 1860 presidential election attended church that year. We also have to keep in mind that that number is probably inflated a bit by the fact that only men were able to vote in 1860, but nevertheless it shows that a lot more people were in church than were actively engaged in the political process. Also fascinating, in 1860, the total value of all church property, as you can see, was $187 million. And Knoll notes that of all the American industries, only the railroads enjoyed greater capital investments. It shows the importance of religion at the time. At the time, there were 35 churches in the United States per one bank. Compared to 4 to 1 today, all you need to do is drive through Gettysburg and you see about 1 million banks. And then finally, it's important to remember also that at the time, pretty much every institution of higher learning was either led by a religious organization or by clergy, including the two that were here in Gettysburg. Religion was so powerful a cultural force at the time of the Civil War that James McPherson warns us to not overlook it. He writes, "Religion was central to the meaning of the Civil War as the generation that experienced the war tried to understand it. And religion should also be central to our efforts to recover that meaning." We cannot hope to understand the American Civil War without understanding American religious life at the time and its role in the coming and the shaping of the conflict. Now, obviously, the topic of religion in the Civil War as a whole is much too broad to cover in a 1-hour lecture. I will spare you that. Whole volumes have been written on the topic, and it would probably take an entire winter lecture series to do justice to that topic. So if Chris Gwynn is looking for ideas for next year, you can all recommend Religion in the Civil War if you're interested in learning more about it. But by focusing in on the Presbyterian Church, what I hope to do is provide a vantage point today on the coming of the Civil War that's both unique from that of other American churches and also captures the importance of religion for understanding the war. The Presbyterian Church at the time was the final church to divide along sectional lines that was both part of the American cultural mainstream and also was found across the nations. Presbyterian churches were not confined to one region, but you could find them in the north, you could find them in the south, you could find them in the west, and nor were they located in either largely urban or rural locations. They were found in both settings. Chances are, if you were traveling the country in 1860, you were not very far from a Presbyterian church. Now, it was the third largest church in America at the time. The two largest and fastest growing churches in the antebellum era, the Methodist and Baptist churches, both divided over slavery in the 1840s along somewhat similar lines. The Methodist Church divided in 1844 concerning the discipline of a bishop who was also a slaveholder. And after a vote along sectional lines, a commission was appointed by the church to draft a proposal for a peaceful separation of the two churches, of the one church, I should say, into two distinct churches where they evenly divided the funds and other parts of the institution. And American Baptists the following year divided in 1845 over an unwillingness of their home and foreign missions boards to appoint slaveholders as missionaries. And in response to this, the Southern Baptist Convention was formed with members from 9 different southern states. So both of these two large, rapidly growing churches divided in the 1840s. And this inability for pro-slavery and anti-slavery members to coexist peacefully in one church did not bode well for the survival of the American Union. These church divisions highlight the fact that religious arguments were not working to solve the country's problems. Arguments that couldn't keep these churches together certainly were not going to be able to rise to the occasion and keep the country together. But in contrast to these two churches, the Presbyterian Church managed to have relatively little open conflict over the issue of slavery. A theological division that occurred in 1837 that was not without its connections to slavery left the Presbyterian Church without many strong anti-slavery voices. And we'll explore this more later in the lecture, but it also left the church much more united theologically, making many in the church wary of the prospect of dividing the church over slavery. They had a remarkable degree of unity otherwise. And those who were anti-slavery in the Presbyterian Church were by and large content to coexist peacefully side by side with Southern Presbyterians, with whom, as we said, they had a great deal in common theologically. And this result made the Presbyterian Church a significant cultural link holding the two sections of the country together at a time when other churches and cultural institutions seemed to be crumbling apart, seeming to be failing to hold the country together. And when the church divided in 1861, it was a significant turning point in American cultural life in the early days of the Civil War. And to really appreciate the significance of this division of the Presbyterian Church, I think it's necessary to briefly mention a few other religious communions and note some of their differences with the Presbyterian Church as they related to their roles in relation to the American cultural mainstream. The Lutheran Church also did not divide over slavery, and there was actually not a formal division until 1863. But Lutheran churches, one of the reasons they managed to avoid that, Lutheran churches tended to be organized and governed far more regionally than centrally, and that made it much easier for them to avoid a formal divisions. And also historically, Lutherans tended to be ethnically German or Scandinavian and were not quite as connected to the American cultural mainstream as those who had the roots in British Protestantism. And fascinatingly, as I was just looking through some information for this lecture, I stumbled upon the fact that we still have never had an American president who has been a member of the Lutheran Church. But the Lutheran Church was not as much a national institution that served as a link between the two sides of the country in the way that the Presbyterian Church did. Similarly to the Lutherans, Roman Catholics were also by and large not viewed as being part of the American cultural mainstream. And if you know your antebellum political history, you will know that in the 1850s, anti-immigrant sentiment and anti-Catholicism tended to go hand in hand with the rise of the Know-Nothing Party. And while the Catholic Church in America was growing rapidly due to immigrants from Catholic countries, they tended to be viewed with suspicion by American Protestants because of their historic prejudices and the institutional ties of the church to Rome. And this institutional connection to Rome actually helped the American Catholic Church to remain united institutionally throughout the American Civil War, but because of their outsider status, the church was not, again, viewed as an American institution holding the two sides of the country together. Episcopalians, while very much part of the cultural mainstream, tended to be smaller in number than Presbyterians and were generally located in more urban areas of the country, found less in rural parts of the country, and also were viewed as being part of the cultural elite rather than the true mainstream of American cultural life. Similarly, Congregationalists, they were also very much part of the cultural mainstream and cultural elite, but they were by and large located pretty much entirely in the North and therefore not viewed as this unifying force that could keep the country together. And then lastly, American Judaism was very small, not very much part of the cultural mainstream, and it also tended to be very, very decentralized in nature and accommodate views on slavery that varied by region. So those are some of the larger faith groups. Many of the others were just simply small enough that they did not have that type of institutional clout that some of these other churches did. As we said earlier, the Presbyterian Church managed to remain in a united national institution meeting annually when other institutions like these other churches seemed to be crumbling apart. And from 1845 onward, the stat was amazing. The General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church was the largest annual gathering in the country, representing all of the sections of the country after that of the United States Congress. All the other religious gatherings, all the other cultural gatherings either tended to be biannual or tended to be more regional in scope. The General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church was a significant annual event in the life of the nation. So this lecture will explore that division of the church, its background, and argue that the divide of the church in 1861 was a significant cultural turning point in the American Civil War because it represented a break in the final cultural institution uniting the North and the South. They met in May of 1861, 1 month after Fort Sumter and the call for troops, after the formation of the Confederate government. When the church split, it was, as the title of my lecture says, the breaking of the final bond. Now, before we launch into the history, though, I do think a brief description of Presbyterian church government and structure will be helpful to understand a bit of the ecclesiastical context. So, every Presbyterian church, which you can see located by the squares on the bottom, they are led by a group of elders. The name Presbyterian comes from the Greek word presbyter, meaning elder, with the ministers of the church also serving as the elders. And a group of Presbyterian churches in a larger region form a presbytery with the ministers represented in the presbytery and typically a representative of one of the elders from the local churches. And then a group of presbyteries in a specific region, which tended to be by state, but not exclusively by state, was referred to as a synod. And then finally, all of the presbyteries, once a year, would send representatives to the General Assembly of the church. And so an easy way, I think, to remember it, I mean, this is Gettysburg after all. You all know your military history. You can just think of it like you got brigades here and divisions here and then corps, and they make up the whole army. So this is your Presbyterian order of battle, if you will. But the General Assembly was the primary reason that the church was viewed as a truly national institution. Both Presbyterians, North and South, looked to the General Assembly as the highest court of the church to provide guidance and leadership. It was what gave the church its national character. And as you can see from the quote there, the Presbyterian Constitution referred to it as the bond of union, peace, correspondence, and mutual confidence among all our churches. And that phrase, the bond of union, was often picked up by antebellum Presbyterians who would refer to their church, represented by the General Assembly, as the bond of union, a bond of union holding the nation together in a time when sectional strife was tearing the country apart. And 150 years later, it may sound absurd to think that a church could have preserved the union. But many Presbyterians sincerely believed that they could, believed that they had a responsibility to the country to set an example of how business could be done and conducted peacefully despite the sectional differences. And one observer wrote home of the 1856 General Assembly taking place during an election year. He said, "It seemed almost incredible, among all the political strife and fierce encounters of the day, to see a body of men from every section of the country moving on from day to day in undisturbed tranquility of temper and harmony of sentiment. Where on earth shall we find another like it?" But one of the reasons why the Presbyterian General Assembly had this seemingly unparalleled degree of peace was that it tried actively, especially as the war grew closer and closer, as the country grew more and more divided, they tried actively to avoid the issue of slavery. It's impossible, really, to understand the history of the Presbyterian Church and the coming of the Civil War without discussing a little bit of the debates about slavery that took place in the church. And so by the time of the war, the General Assembly was, as we said, trying to avoid the issue entirely. They were concerned that any action taken by the church would divide the church. But this had not always been the case. And like many early Americans, Presbyterians, on the whole, were not afraid to speak about slavery, and they weren't afraid to condemn slavery either. In their eyes, like that of many early Americans, it was viewed as an evil that many felt the country should be rid of, but they tended to view it as an evil that the colonial system had kind of left them with, and they did not believe that there was much of an easy way to deal with it. It was kind of a necessary evil, if you will. Both sides tended to agree that it was less than ideal, and as a whole, a policy of gradual emancipation was viewed by many Presbyterians as the best approach to handling slavery. Immediate emancipation, though it sounds horrible, it was viewed as dangerous to society because they believed that freed slaves were a threat to the order of society. And most Americans did not believe that freed slaves could participate as full citizens without some kind of formal education. And that was a best-case scenario. Many simply believed, because of their racial prejudices, that the two races could never peacefully live side by side. And because of this, the very first policy of the Presbyterian Church was in favor of working toward both abolition, they said, but also toward the education of African Americans. And it's striking, in light of later developments especially, how clearly in favor of emancipation this statement is. It will highlight, as we go through the various statements by the Presbyterian Church in the United States, it will highlight the changes in attitudes towards slavery taking place in the church and in American cultural life. So the Synod of New York and Philadelphia, then representing basically the entire church in America, they declared in 1787 this lengthy statement. They said, "The Creator of the world having made of one flesh all the children of men, it becomes them, as members of the same family, to consult and promote each other's happiness. It is more especially the duties of those who maintain the rights of humanity and who acknowledge and teach the obligations of Christianity to use such means as are in their power to extend the blessings of equal freedom to every part of the human race. From a full conviction of these truths and sensible that the rights of human nature are too well understood to admit of debate, overtured that the Synod of New York and Philadelphia recommend in the warmest terms to every member of their body and to all the churches and families under their care to do everything in their power consistent with the rights of civil society to promote the abolition of slavery and the instruction of Negroes, whether bond or free. Note how clearly that statement affirmed the common humanity of these slaves, how they were entitled to the same human rights. Shockingly, that would become controversial in later years. There were some who argued that slaves and the African American race was in some sense subhuman and that they were naturally fit to be slaves, religious people making these arguments. So this policy from the outset is very stark in how strong it stated the duty was for Presbyterians to work towards emancipation as a goal. Abolition was the stated position of the Presbyterian Church from the very beginning. This statement was made, as you can see, before there even was a formal Presbyterian church in the United States of America. They adopted the name the following year. And this stated policy was interestingly referenced over and over again by the early church. It was never formally challenged by Southern Presbyterians, and a few more statements were penned on slavery in the years between 1787 and 1818, but by and large, they were all in reference to this statement that I just read being foundational to the church's position on slavery. But by 1818, if you remember the political context, a few years later in 1820, you'll have the Missouri Compromise. Clearly, slavery is becoming a bigger political issue, and Presbyterians wanted their General Assembly to speak to the issue involved. There were those petitioning the church to ask whether slaveholders could in fact remain members in good standing of the church. And the position of the church was also very strong here. They tried to strike a balance, but it was very strong in its language about slavery. The very first thing they stated, which again is remarkable when you think about the kind of fugitive slave laws and the way slaves were bought and sold in the South in later years, the church stated very clearly that any member of the church who sold a slave who was also a member of the church who did not want to be sold, the person selling that slave would be excommunicated from the church. They were not allowed to sell slaves who were unwilling to be sold. And as you can see, it indicted slavery as a gross violation, inconsistent with the law of God. I'm going to read the whole paragraph again because I think it's important to highlight how strong their language was and how much this strong language ends up being softened in later years. The assembly began, we consider the voluntary enslaving of one portion of the human race by another as a gross violation of the most precious and sacred rights of human nature, as utterly inconsistent with the law of God, which requires us to love our neighbor as ourselves, and as totally irreconcilable with the spirit and principles of the gospel of Christ, which enjoin that all things whatsoever ye would that men should do to you, do ye even so to them. Slavery creates a paradox in the moral system. It exhibits rational, accountable, and immortal beings in such circumstances as scarcely to leave them the power of moral action. It exhibits them as dependent on the will of others, whether they shall receive religious instruction, whether they shall know and worship the true God, whether they shall enjoy the ordinances of the gospel, whether they shall perform the duties and cherish the endearments of husbands and wives, parents and children, neighbors and friends, whether they shall preserve their chastity and purity, or regard the dictates of justice and humanity. Such are some of the consequences of slavery, consequences not imaginary, but which connect themselves to its very existence. Such a stark condemnation of slavery would be unthinkable a generation later. But in 1818, it was a very clear attack on the institution of slavery, not only in the abstract, but as it was actually practiced in the American South. But it is careful, I do need to be careful to point out that the church wanted to soften some of the language to try to accommodate Southern Presbyterians. It went on to say that there were portions of our church and our country where the evil of slavery has been entailed upon them, and that in these places, the number of slaves, their ignorance, and their vicious habits generally render an immediate and universal emancipation inconsistent alike with the safety and happiness of both the master and the slave. So, by and large, a very strong anti-slavery statement tried to reconcile it with a policy of gradual emancipation to continue to seek the peace and the unity of the church. Because this statement occurred in response to petitions asking whether Southerners could in fact remain members in good standing in the church despite being slaveholders, the assembly cautioned, "We at the same time exhort others to forbear harsh censures and uncharitable reflections on their brethren who unhappily live among slaves whom they cannot immediately set free, but who at the same time are really using all their influence and all their endeavors to bring them into a state of freedom as soon as a door for it can be safely opened." And in the eyes of anti-slavery Presbyterians, by and large, far too few of their brethren in the Presbyterian Church were actively working with all of their influence to bring their slaves into a state of freedom. But as a whole, I think we need to see that the 1818 Declaration was a clear condemnation of slavery in its context, especially as it relates to later statements. It attacked the practice of slavery and tried to seek a balance, but still it left the policy of the church unchanged from that of abolition. The goal was to work for the abolition of slaves. And this statement would be the last official statement by the Presbyterian Church until the 1830s. And that was not because the issue of slavery went away, but because, by and large, they worked very hard to try to keep the issue from coming up at the General Assembly. They did not want to risk a division over slavery. And so by the time the slavery question finally reached the General Assembly again in 1835, a few significant changes had taken place in American life that made it really impossible to ignore the issue, because people were beginning to argue for the first time consistently and thoroughly and rigorously that slavery was not just a necessary evil, but that it was actually, in fact, a positive good for society. And I think the emergence of this pro-slavery ideology, this ideology that attempted to be fully consistent with saying slavery is good for society, it emerges in part as a reaction to the growing abolitionist movement in the North. But I think also the major turning point in American thought on this issue and Southern thought on this issue comes in the aftermath of the slave rebellion by Nat Turner in 1831. Because of that rebellion, where slaves killed a number of Southerners, Southerners became convinced that abolitionism was a radical threat, not only to their way of life, but also to the peace and good order of society. And in response to this, many turned to the Bible to defend slavery. And fascinatingly, we tend to overlook this, but historians estimate that over 50% of both the pro- and anti-slavery tracts in this period were written by ministers. The church had a huge role to play in this debate about slavery as it began to unfold throughout the country. And one of the earliest of these arguments by a Presbyterian came during debates in the Synod of Virginia, where George Baxter argued from the biblical household codes found in the New Testament that slavery had the same kind of biblical support as the institution of marriage did. Pretty shocking. And most in the Synod at the time viewed his arguments as extreme, it was said. And they rejected it by and large, but it did mark the beginning, a major turning point where Presbyterians began the practice that became so consistent with the pro-slavery ideology. They began quoting biblical texts that made reference to slavery as though they approved of the South's peculiar institution. And similar arguments as were advanced in Virginia began to be made by a Presbyterian minister named James Smiley in Mississippi. And initially, his views were deemed so extreme that his presbytery actually asked him not to publish them because of how extreme they were. And one person recollected some 30 years later, he said, initially, every person, without exception, thought him somewhat fanatical. The idea that the Bible did sanction slavery was regarded as a new doctrine, even in Mississippi. But this man went on to say, he said, but his scriptural argument has never been answered, nor can it be. Talk about a radical change in the understanding. Southern Presbyterians started to argue that the Bible talked about slavery, didn't seem to condemn it. Therefore, slavery was approved of by the Bible. And all of these changes highlight the fact that the views on slavery were diverging rapidly by the time of the 1830s, even more sharply than before. And both sides, pro- and anti-slavery Presbyterians, believed that the Presbyterian General Assembly needed to take some kind of further action on the issue. But this time was also a tumultuous one for the Presbyterian Church theologically. And the 1830s saw a number of theological disagreements that would eventually lead to division in 1837. And a portion of the church was increasingly concerned with theology coming out of New England that seemed to depart from a traditional Presbyterian understanding of original sin. And many of these New England Presbyterians were part of the church because of an agreement that had been reached with the Congregational Church in 1801 to allow congregational ministers to be ordained in Presbyterian churches and vice versa, to try to work together as the churches expanded together into the western part of the country. And this agreement, referred to as the Plan of Union, led to rapid growth in the Presbyterian Church, particularly in western New York and in Ohio, the old Northwest at the time. But it also led to a number of Presbyterian pastors who tended to be more congregational than truly Presbyterian in their theology. And eventually, as the issues began to come out more in church courts, there was a split into two parties. The conservative old school party, advocating for a traditional understanding of Presbyterian theology, and the new school party, more sympathetic to the events of the Second Great Awakening going on and much more broad in its theology. And most of the abolitionists in the Presbyterian Church at the time tended to be members of this new school party. I think it's another thing we often forget about. The abolitionist movement needs to be seen in its larger context of the Second Great Awakening, with the rise of other types of social reform movements, such as the temperance movement, and even the rise of revivalism taking place in the 1830s. The 1830s were really tumultuous times for most churches in America as they all tried to wrestle with how they were going to respond to the Second Great Awakening, the rise of revivalism, and the rise of powerful social reform movements. And throughout the 1830s, there were various trials in the Presbyterian Church at the Presbyterian Synod level for heresy, and a few even reached the General Assembly on appeal. And these appeals tended to generate pretty intense battles between the old and new schools for control at the assembly. And in the midst of all this theological controversy, in the midst of trials and debate, the issue of slavery finally came up at the 1835 General Assembly. And being Presbyterian, the assembly did what Presbyterians like to do. They formed a committee. Yes, exactly. We have a lot of Presbyterians in the audience. They formed a committee, and they instructed the committee to report back on the subject the following year. And the committee concluded with this meandering statement after a year of very hard work. They said, whereas the subject of slavery is inseparably connected with and regulated by the laws of many of the states in this union, and which it is by no means proper for an ecclesiastical judicatory to interfere, and involves many considerations, in regard to which great diversity of opinion and intensity of feeling are known to exist in the churches represented by this assembly. And whereas there is every reason to believe that any action on the part of the assembly in reference to this subject would tend to distract and divide our churches, and would probably in no wise promote the benefit of those whose welfare is immediately contemplated in the memorials in question. Therefore, resolved that it is not expedient for the assembly to take any further action in relation to this subject.
Then they sat down and had dinner.
Yeah, exactly. You can see the stated policy. The committee recommended that the assembly do nothing. And ironically, it was Northern abolitionists and Southern pro-slavery Presbyterians who were most vocal, working together to demand that the assembly would try to take some kind of action. But attempts at further action were curtailed by moderates, north and south, interestingly working really across the theological divide at the time, who really wished to avoid further deliberation at all. The report, fascinatingly, the report that recommended that they do nothing was actually not formally adopted by the assembly, who decided that formally adopting a report that said we should do nothing would be too much action on the subject. So they voted to lay the matter on the table and refused to consider it at all any further. So this report, it wasn't even actually formally adopted. And so I think this does highlight that something that I do want to highlight for as we go forward. I think it's unfair to say that the old school and new school parties were in some sense a pro-slavery and anti-slavery party. In the theological trials that took place, we have the record of the votes, and voting patterns suggest that there wasn't a direct correspondence to who voted for what in terms of theology and who voted for what in terms of the issue of slavery. But what there is evidence for, I think there is some evidence that suggests that members of the old school party in the North increasingly began to be concerned that if Southerners seceded from the church over slavery, the new school would have a permanent majority at the General Assembly that they would not be able to overcome. That was a perceived threat to the old school party. And between the 1836 and 1837 General Assemblies, it appears that the old school was working towards a division. It seems that both sides expected a division and began to prepare for a division, and both worked to achieve a majority at the next assembly so that division could take place on their terms. And Southerners in particular were aware that removing the new school party from the church would remove the large majority of Presbyterian abolitionists. The American Presbyterian, which was published in Nashville, read pretty widely in the South, they wrote, "By delivering ourselves from New Schoolism, we also get clear of abolitionism." And in some of the communications back and forth, it appears that the old school members of the North were particularly aware that they did not want to offend the Southern members of the old school party who they needed at the upcoming General Assembly. And so at the 1837 Assembly, the old school managed to achieve really its first majority. And as they tested the waters, they began to realize they had a clear voting majority. And they decided to vote formally to remove 4 synods of the church that were formed under the Plan of Union, the agreement with Congregational churches, on the grounds that the Plan of Union was out of order with the Presbyterian Constitution, and therefore the churches and synods formed under it were not valid. And that vote passed, and those synods were removed formally from the church. You couldn't vote in a trial where you were deemed to be a part of the party, so those synods were not able to vote in that vote. And after that vote, after it became clear those synods were out of the picture, the issue of slavery came up again at the assembly, and this time Southerners were now content to table the matter entirely. They did not feel that action needed to be taken now that the new school, significant portion, I should say, of the new school had been removed from the church. And so the following year, the assembly refused to seat the new school delegates that were sent from those synods, and those synods removed themselves formally then. They formed a separate Presbyterian church. There was a legal battle over who was entitled to the name the Presbyterian Church in the United States, and a separate Presbyterian church was ultimately formed. But the old school party was allowed to maintain their link with the name the Presbyterian Church in the United States of America. So when I talk about the Presbyterian Church going forward, I'm by and large talking about the old school portion of the church. But I think that is significant because this division left the church much more conservative theologically and much more conservative on the issue of slavery, as we said at the outset. They had a remarkable degree of theological unity. They did not want to risk further divisions in the church, and by and large, the old school Presbyterians who were anti-slavery tried to avoid overtly provoking the South because they wanted to maintain this significant unity that they had in terms of their theology. Now, after this divide, there was a portion of the church that wanted the now old school Presbyterian church to formally clarify and state whether they still stood behind those earlier positions on the slavery issue. And so the final issue taken place, the final slavery debate really that took place in 1845. Remember, this is the year after the Methodist Church splits, the year that the Baptist Church splits over slavery. And once again, a committee was formed to produce a statement. They tried to be nuanced and strike a balanced position that all could agree on. But this time they did, for the first time, argue formally that the Bible did not condemn slaveholding as a sin. They denounced the ways that slaves were treated as property and regarded as subhuman under existing slave laws. They acknowledged many of the evils that existed under the system as it was practiced, but they were clear that slaveholding in and of itself was not sinful and should not be a ground for being removed from the Presbyterian Church. And the committee that formed this statement tried to be really clear that in crafting this statement, they were not departing from any of the prior positions. They were simply affirming them, but also recognizing that the Bible didn't specifically condemn slavery in their words. But they concluded with this ominous warning about taking any further action. And they stated that the petitions that ask the assembly to make the holding of slaves a matter of discipline do virtually require this judicatory to dissolve itself and abandon the organization under which, by the divine blessing, it has so long prospered. The tendency is evidently to separate the northern from the southern portion of the church, a result which every good citizen must deplore, as tending to the dissolution of the union of our beloved country, and which every enlightened Christian will oppose as bringing a ruinous and unnecessary schism between brethren who maintain a common faith. They were trying to maintain their unity. And here we see as early as 1845 that Presbyterians were speaking of their church as a vital link uniting the two sections of this increasingly divided country. And one attendee, after the vote, wrote home to the Watchman of the South. He said, "When I think of the probable good effects of this action of the Assembly on the whole church and the whole country, I thank God and take courage. I feel now, more than I have done for the past 10 years, that the Union is safe." So why spend so much time detailing the actions of the Presbyterian Church on slavery? Well, just like the fact that we can't jump into the Civil War in 1861 and really hope to understand it in any meaningful way. I think it's really important to highlight the lengths to which the church went to avoid a split over slavery. It shows that the issues were bubbling for a really, really long time. But it also highlights, by working all the way from 1787 up through 1845 and beyond, it highlights the changes in attitude toward slavery that were taking place in the Presbyterian Church and across the Republic from the early days of the country to the years immediately before the war. The rise of these pro-slavery arguments from the Bible highlights the fact that this challenge of slavery was a matter that the churches tried and failed to overcome. And shockingly, missing entirely almost from these arguments was the debate about whether race-based chattel slavery in any way corresponded to what the Bible referred to as slavery. One of the few people who picked this up and commented on it publicly was Abraham Lincoln, who pointed out in 1859 that biblical slavery was, quote, of men without reference to color. And in response to some of these arguments from the Bible, it also should be pointed out that some vocal abolitionists, such as William Lloyd Garrison, argued that if the Bible condoned slavery, the Bible was simply wrong. Now, to the mind of antebellum Presbyterians, that argument was viewed as far more dangerous to the good order of society than Southern slavery was. If you remember how strongly the public reacted when Garrison publicly burned a copy of the Constitution and called it a compact with the devil, you'll have a bit of an understanding of how people at that time would have responded to his argument that if the Bible condoned slavery, the Bible was wrong. Garrison was viewed as an extremist, and many Presbyterians basically used him as a target in their debates on the subject. And so many abolitionists did try to use the Bible to attack Southern slavery, but Southerners, again, they dismissed these arguments with appeals to the obvious reading of biblical texts where slavery was discussed and not condemned. They also attacked a line of reasoning that used the nuanced arguments from these Northerners about how the Bible was how slavery was inconsistent with the principles of the Bible. They said that if you cede to those principles of reasoning, you'll end up undermining biblical authority. You'll end up making the same kind of arguments that Garrison did. So by and large, abolitionists had a harder time as they tried to use the Bible to attack slavery. The argument was very easy to just quote a text and see the Bible and say, "See, the Bible doesn't condemn slavery." And in light of this, Mark Knoll, again in his book, he argues that what was most needed in the antebellum era was a careful, nuanced debate about biblical slavery. He said such arguments rarely left the academic sphere. When they did, they still largely avoided the elephant in the room of race, refusing to bring that into the discussion. And Knoll concludes, very interestingly, that a failure in biblical interpretation was a major factor in the coming of the Civil War. This impasse in religious debate highlighted the fact that there appeared to be no solution facing the country. As both sides appealed to the Bible and disagreed, it became increasingly likely that the country was going to divide in Knowles' argument. Now finally, the debate about slavery in the Presbyterian Church shows that Presbyterians long before 1861 viewed their church as a vital cultural institution linking the North and South. And as we said earlier, it may sound silly to think that a church division could lead to a divide of the nation. But Henry Clay warned in 1852, he said, "This sundering of religious ties which have hitherto bound our people together, I consider the greatest source of danger to our country. If our religious men cannot live together in peace, what can be expected of us politicians? Those," he said, "very few of whom profess to be governed by the great principles of love." So Clay believed that the divisions of the church was a threat to the unity of the country. And so when the Presbyterian Church met in May of 1861, a month after Fort Sumter and Lincoln's call for troops, Presbyterians genuinely believed that a final show of unity may just be able to help save the Union. And in hindsight, their optimism sounds naive at best, delusional at worst, but at the time of the assembly, as we've said over and over again, they were the final major church that had not divided, the only bond of union left after the 1860 election and Southern secession. And Cyrus McCormick, interestingly, the prominent Chicago businessman and Presbyterian elder, he was once quoted as saying, it may be apocryphal, but it's a great quote, he said, "The two great hoops holding the Union together were the Democratic Party and the old school Presbyterian Church." And after the election of 1860, it was very clear that the Democratic Party was not going to be holding the Union together. And so, like the rest of the country, Presbyterians spent the winter of 1860 and 1861 anxious about the future, debating the consequences of the election of Abraham Lincoln. And on November 21st, 1860, South Carolinian James Henley Thornwell, the most prominent Southern Presbyterian, he's often referred to as the Presbyterian Calhoun, he said this: "The Union, which our fathers designed to be perpetual, is on the verge of dissolution. Even though our cause may be just and our course approved of heaven, our path to victory may be through a baptism of blood. Our state may suffer, she may suffer grievously, she may suffer long. Be it so. We shall love her all the more tenderly, and the more intensely, the more bitterly she suffers." Benjamin Palmer, another major prominent Southern Presbyterian minister in New Orleans, he preached of the duty to loyalty to the Southern cause, which he stated was a trust to preserve and transmit our existing system of domestic servitude with the right, unchanged by man, to go and root itself wherever providence and nature may carry it. And he went on to say, "This trust we will discharge in the face of the worst possible peril. Though war be the aggregation of all evils, yet should the madness of the hour appeal to the arbitration of the sword, we will not shrink even from the baptism of fire. Not till the last man has fallen behind the last rampart shall it drop from our hands." Southern Presbyterians were preparing for war. The time for peaceful coexistence was over. And in addition to numerous sermons preached and articles written in the press, Southern Presbyterians were a major force advocating for secession. Thomas R.R. Cobb, later a Confederate brigadier general in McLaw's division, who was mortally wounded at Fredericksburg, he wrote to the Southern Presbyterian this quote that you see there: "This revolution has been accomplished mainly by the churches." In contrast to Southern Presbyterians, the most prominent Northern Presbyterian, Charles Hodge, desperately wished to avoid war. He had been professor of theology at Princeton Theological Seminary for more than 40 years, and perhaps more than any other Presbyterian at the time, he embodied the conservative, non-confrontational approach of Northern Presbyterians. He was opposed to abolitionism. He went out of his way to attack abolitionists. He defended slavery in theory, but he argued that as it was practiced in the South, it was both unbiblical and inconsistent with the principles of Republican government. And he argued that the best approach in the United States to ending slavery was not debating abstractly about whether or not slavery was wrong or inherently evil, but to attack the institution specifically as it was practiced in the South and to promote gradual emancipation. He warned in 1836 that Southerners have to choose between emancipation by the silent and holy influence of the gospel, securing the elevation of slaves to the stature of free men, or to abide the issue of a long-continued conflict against the laws of God. And he concluded with a caution that if they failed to do this, they must prepare themselves for the natural consequences, whatever they may be. But in January of 1861, Hodge desperately wished to avoid any consequences of a war to perpetuate Southern slavery. And he wrote an article for the Princeton Review that was widely circulated that secession was unconstitutional, that Southerners did not have legitimate grounds to secede, but he also extended an olive branch to the South, saying once again that he blamed abolitionists as the instigators of the conflict, that the majority in the North did not support abolitionism, that this was all basically a big misunderstanding, and that the two sides really should just calm down a little bit. And many in the North actually appreciated the nuance of Hodge's argument. He came out strongly in favor of the Union, but they were rejected out of hand in the South. And Hodge appears to be kind of surprised by this. He was really hoping for a warmer reception. And so in the frenzied aftermath of all this debate, the press really could not avoid taking stands on the issues, both the Presbyterian Church as well as the wider press. A wide range of opinions were being published and debated, and it was clear that this topic would dominate the upcoming General Assembly when it met in May. But still, as the Assembly began to meet, there were still a few who wanted to hold on to their hope that the church could avoid a division. At the very least, they hoped that they could keep a majority of Southern churches in the church. And they hoped that by showing up at the assembly and keeping with the historic practice of their church, that to avoid speaking to political questions, they could avoid a split, avoid producing a statement that would give offense to either side. Though many believed that it was perfectly legitimate for individual ministers to publish their opinions on the subject, they were hoping that the church as a whole would remain silent. So, whether or not it was appropriate for the church to take a stand was an issue that was hotly debated when Presbyterians met at the 7th Presbyterian Church in Philadelphia in May of 1861. The very first day of the assembly, the outgoing moderator, the Reverend John W. Yeomans, preached a sermon from John 18:36, "My kingdom is not of this world," in an attempt to calm the assembly. But hope that the church would remain undivided looked pretty much doomed from the outset when more than half of the Southern presbyteries did not send a representative to the assembly. The synods of South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, North Carolina, and Arkansas did not send a single delegate. Only the synods of Kentucky and Missouri were entirely represented, both border states. Even the synod of Baltimore, which consisted of Maryland and part of Northern Virginia, was not fully represented. So it looks like Southern Presbyterians were essentially already preparing to form their own church, but they were still hoping that if the church remained silent, they could keep at least a majority of Southern Presbyterians united with the church. And this hope was buoyed with the election of the Reverend John C. Backus from the border state of Maryland as the moderator of the assembly. And even the hope was buoyed by the first 3 days of the assembly, which proceeded rather typically with reports on from the various committees. The only mention of the crisis in the minutes comes from a report from a committee who said they couldn't do their work due to the disturbed condition of the country. But on the third day of the assembly, the Reverend Dr. Gardner Spring of Brick Presbyterian Church in New York stood up and moved that a special committee be appointed to inquire into the expediency of this assembly making some expression of their devotion to the union of these states and their loyalty to the government. And amazingly, this action was almost entirely avoided. The assembly quickly voted to table the motion by a vote of 123 to 102. So he moved it, and they said, let's take it off the table. Let's not discuss the matter at all. and it appeared to succeed. Those who were in favor of Spring's resolution, they asked that the votes be recorded by name rather than simply counted, but that was not done, which would have been great if they had done that, because we would have known who changed their vote from the first day, from the first time it was considered to by the end of the assembly when they voted in favor of these resolutions. So the business continued to proceed as usual, but Spring was undeterred. He was the son of a Revolutionary War veteran. He loved the country, and Spring knew from the press that public opinion was on his side. And so he offered his own resolution and called for the church, as you can read there, to do all in her power to promote and perpetuate the integrity of these United States and to strengthen, uphold, and encourage the federal government. And his opponents immediately recognized that the press was behind Spring. They realized they couldn't avoid it, so Hodge responded by moving that the resolutions be considered in 2 days' time. They tried to buy some time to come up with a solution, and after they were taken up, the resolutions dominated the debate of the assembly. And Hodge tried to compromise in a manner consistent with the church in the antebellum era. He met with Southerners who were at the assembly, and he decided that a suitable position would be for the church to declare that her members must be loyal to the Constitution without any further statement about what that meant. It didn't decide the political question. And Hodge was concerned that the General Assembly wasn't a northern or southern body. He was also concerned that many southern presbyteries weren't represented there, and he said, "We are not willing to sever this last bond which holds the North and South together in the fellowship of the gospel." Hodge would argue for his position, but he'd eventually withdraw it due to a lack of support. And after days of discussion with no agreement, Hodge thought he saw another way out. He moved once again that the matter be tabled, thinking that maybe people had just grown tired of considering the topic. And Hodge must have been surprised by how strongly this was rejected. That vote was rejected 86 to 153. So clearly the pressure of public opinion. If you think that the first vote to table passed 123 to 102, and this vote was 86 to 153. And not surprisingly, all of the Southern delegates voted to table. Almost all refused to support any action the Assembly might take. And so finally, as the impasse continued the following morning, the Assembly approved an idea that had initially been rejected. They formed a committee to report on all of the resolutions before the Assembly to offer their own recommendations. And Hodge was placed on the committee by the moderator. One last attempt was made at compromise. Hodge changed some of his language to be more clearly pro-union, hoping that that would do. He said that the Presbyterians had an obligation to work to maintain the Constitution of these United States in the full exercise of all its legitimate powers to preserve our beloved union unimpaired. And Hodge himself, remember, was personally pro-union. He believed secession was illegal, but he wanted desperately for there to be compromise. His major concern was the unity of the church. He did everything he could to avoid a split. And Hodge wrote the majority report that was ended up being supported by 8 of the 9 committee members. There was only one dissenter who offered essentially the original text that Spring introduced in his resolutions with a few minor changes in wordings. And the key difference between the two was that Spring's resolutions made it absolutely clear that Presbyterians owed their loyalty to the federal government as opposed to the government of their state. And as these committee reports were put before the Assembly, a few members of Lincoln's cabinet even got involved. Hodge reported to the Assembly that Attorney General Edward M. Bates had declared in a telegram, "The best you can do for the Union is to keep unbroken the unity of your church." That caused quite a stir in the Assembly, but not to be outdone, those in favor of the other report received a telegram from Salmon P. Chase, the Treasury Secretary, who said that he saw no valid objection to unequivocal expressions in favor of the Constitution, union, and freedom. And so when the Assembly finally voted on these reports. The majority report was defeated, 84 to 128. This was a report that 8 of the 9 committee members approved of. After the defeat of the majority report, the minority report was amended to include a brief explanation outlining that the statement of support for the federal government did not entail political support for the Lincoln administration, but was simply an expression of loyalty to the government of the United States. And this report then easily passed 156 to 66, indicating that after the majority report failed, a significant number supported the minority report over a policy of silence. It's likely, as we said before, that a few also felt the pressure to vote in favor of the resolutions due to the press and public opinion. Hodge later wrote of Dr. J.G. Bergen, a minister in Illinois, who came to him prior to the vote and asked him what he should do. And he said he was personally opposed to the resolutions, but that if he voted against them, he could never go home. And when the moderator called his name, Dr. Bergen replied, "I want to say no, but I must say yes." The vote had passed, and in response, Hodge and others submitted a final formal protest, arguing that the resolutions violated the Constitution of the Presbyterian Church. Hodge wrote the protest. It was signed by 58 other dissenting ministers. A few others submitted their own protest, but Hodge wrote that he did not want his protest to be interpreted as a sign of disloyalty to the Union, but he did say, "We deny the right of the General Assembly to decide the political question to what government the allegiance of Presbyterians as citizens is due." He was concerned that by declaring their loyalty to the federal government, they had disregarded the sincere and conscientious convictions of those ministers and members, he said, who believe that the allegiance of citizens of this country is primarily due to the states to which they respectively belong. Answering this question, he said, is a matter clearly beyond the jurisdiction of the Assembly. He concluded that he thought the actions of the Assembly were unjust and cruel in its bearing on our Southern brethren, many of whom were not present at the Assembly, and would not only diminish, quote, the resources of the church, but greatly weaken its power for good and expose it to the danger of being carried away more and more from its true principles by a worldly or fanatical spirit. And the committee the committee who was appointed to respond to the protests was chaired by the Reverend Thomas E. Thomas. And they quoted Hodge in response to Hodge, who in January had written in his State of the Country, he said, "There are occasions when the political questions rise into the sphere of morals and religion." They concluded that the Assembly was simply applying the moral obligation of Christians to be loyal to those in authority, including the federal government of the United States. And they pointed out that even the name of the church, the Presbyterian Church in the United States of America, made the church, quote, contemporaneous with that of our federal government. And then finally, the committee concluded that it was in no way unjust to Southerners, as many Southern states were in fact represented, and, quote, all might have just as easily been represented. Southerners, they argued, had already decided to remove themselves from the church. And so with the protests answered, the Assembly returned to its regular business, and in keeping with the principles of the Presbyterian Church, they dissolved itself a few days later and required a newly elected assembly to convene at the First Presbyterian Church of Columbus, Ohio, in the following May. And when the assembly dissolved, in May of 1861, it was the last time that northern and southern branches of the Presbyterian Church would meet together until 1983. In response, Southern presbyteries began to secede from the Presbyterian Church, much in the way Southern states had seceded from the Union. Though the number of presbyteries absent from the assembly suggests that Southerners would have formed their own church Anyway, regardless of the outcome, the adoption of the spring resolutions handed them what they wanted on a silver platter. They argued that they had been excommunicated without a trial and were left with no choice but to withdraw. And so on December 4th, 1861, the Presbyterian Church in the Confederate States of America was formed in Augusta, Georgia. And this new Southern General Assembly promptly declared that the actions of the previous General Assembly had been like Pontius Pilate during the trial of Jesus, who, quote, obeyed the clamor of the multitude. In light of this, they said it was necessary to establish a church where Southern Presbyterians would not have to continue under the influence of a, quote, foreign culture. So what had happened to the Presbyterian Church? I think the newspaper, the Philadelphia Presbyterian, summarized the cause of division helpfully when they said politics and religion had become so mixed up that their hates and antagonisms were interchanged, and friendly relations and intercourse in the latter could scarcely have been maintained, while in the former the sword was drawn. The political questions, which had become increasingly impossible to avoid and debate peacefully, ended up dividing the church. The peace that marked the Presbyterian Church in the pre-war era was at best an uneasy peace grounded in avoiding the hard political questions of the day. And when those questions could be ignored no longer, the church ended up splitting. Most of this in the pre-war era was done from a mixture of a legitimate conscientious desire to avoid the mixture of religion and politics, but it was also clearly used to silence the church from engaging in a rigorous debate about slavery. The divide of the Presbyterian Church really highlights the fact that two distinct cultures had developed because of the slavery system. The Presbyterian Church had a remarkable degree of theological unity, a great deal of cultural unity. It was clearly a strong source of unity in the antebellum era, but by the time of the Civil War, that peace could no longer be maintained. Southern Presbyterians clearly felt that their loyalties lay more with a united South than a united Presbyterian Church, and Northern Presbyterians were eager for an expression of loyalty to the federal government. I think the fact that it also took so long for this religious divide to heal, more than 120 years, further illustrates the fact that two distinct cultures had developed in the North and in the South. And religious differences and influences, it certainly influenced how these two cultures developed, but I think the division of the Presbyterian Church, what you see here, it also highlights the way that culture often subtly influences theology and the practice of religion as well. And so as the General Assembly met in May of 1861 and wrestled with how to address the political crisis that was engulfing the nation, they did so as the final representative body of a truly undivided national institution. And the fact that two cabinet secretaries chimed into the events, that the national press was observing the events of the assembly, I think it further highlights the fact that this assembly was a major cultural event. The country was watching to see what would happen. And when the spring resolutions passed, any hope that the Presbyterian Church would remain united was gone. The final bond of union had indeed been broken. But still, as the commissioners left the assembly and returned home, North and South, few probably would have expected just how accurate the fiery sermons of Thornwell and Palmer would be. The nation did indeed go through a baptism of blood and fire. And the bloodshed and suffering provoked a great deal of religious reflection, a measure of religious change from both sides about the war and about their experience of it. And I think few captured the nature and the depth of this religious reflection on the war better than one prominent attendee of Washington's New York Avenue Presbyterian Church, President Abraham Lincoln, did in his second inaugural address. He reflected on the war. He said, "Neither party expected for the war the magnitude, or the duration which it has already attained. Neither anticipated that the cause of the conflict might cease with, or even before the conflict itself should cease. Each looked for an easier triumph and a result less fundamental and astounding. Both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. It may seem strange that any man should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces, but let us judge not, that we be not judged. The prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully. The Almighty has his own purposes. Woe unto the world because of offenses, for it must needs be that offenses come, but woe to that man by whom the offense cometh. If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which, in the providence of God, must needs come, but which, having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that he gives to both North and South this terrible war, as the woe due to those by whom the offense came, shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which the believers in a living God always ascribe to him? Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. As Lincoln pointed out, Presbyterians, North and South, read the same Bible, prayed to the same God, but that was not enough for their church to remain united at the time of the Civil War. Another bond, the bond of slavery, proved to be stronger than that bond of union. So thank you very much for coming out to this lecture today.